There is a document that FIFA never wanted the world to read. A medical report, a squad list altered at the last minute, and a player who took the field in a condition that sports doctors still debate today with astonishment. And at the center of it all, a question that an entire generation of Brazilians carries to this day like an open wound. Was Brazil defeated before even setting foot on the grass of the Stade de France on that July night in 1998? Because what happened in the hours before that final may be the most disturbing story that world football has ever tried to bury. Let's go back. Let's go back carefully, because this story has layers. And every layer you uncover makes what happened that night even harder to accept. It was the Brazil of 1998. And when you say, the Brazil of 1998, you are not talking about just any national team. You are talking about the squad that had conquered the fourth World Cup title in 1994, in the United States, with a generation led by Romario and Bebeto, that partnership that made the entire world stop. But in 1998, the gravitational center of Brazilian football had a single name. A name that, at the time, was synonymous with something that goes beyond sport. Ronaldo Luis Nazario de Lima. The phenomenon. At just 21 years old, Ronaldo was the best player on the planet, a two-time World Cup champion as the youngest member of the 1994 squad, the top scorer in every tournament he entered, holder of the FIFA Best Player Award in 1996 and 1997. He was, at that moment, something football rarely produces, an absolute consensus of genius. The Brazilian squad arrived in France 1998 as the overwhelming favorite. This was not speculation. It was near unanimity among football analysts worldwide. Head coach Mario Zagallo, legendary, a four-time champion as both player and manager, led a team that had, alongside Ronaldo, names like Rivaldo, Bebeto, Roberto Carlos, Cafu, Alder, Lucio, Emerson, and Leonardo. It was a constellation of talent. And they advanced through the tournament with the calmness of a team that knows it is a level above everyone else. On the other side, France. The host nation. A team built patiently by coach Jacquet, who had endured ferocious criticism from the French press for years. Publications had called for him to be fired, claiming he had no idea how to assemble a top-level squad. And yet Jacquet persisted, molding a collective whose central piece was a man of Algerian origin, the son of immigrants, born in the outskirts of Marseille, Zinedine Zidane. The brilliant, the hypnotic, the Zizou. The final was scheduled for July 12, 1998, at the Stade de France in Saint-Denis. 80,000 spectators were expected in the stands, and more than 1 billion people were watching around the world. It was, in every sense, the greatest spectacle on the planet that night. And then, just a few hours before kickoff, something happened that no one has ever been able to fully explain. This is where the story begins to enter territory that few dare to map with honesty. On the afternoon of July 12, Brazil was at their hotel in final preparation. The squad had trained normally in the days before. Ronaldo appeared to be well, or at least he seemed to be. But at some point during that afternoon, something happened to him. The accounts vary, the versions contradict each other, and it is precisely that contradiction that has fueled decades of unanswered questions. What is known with certainty, because it is documented, is the following. Hours before the match, Ronaldo suffered what was later described as a convulsion. A seizure. He was found by roommates. Some say it was fullback Roberto Carlos, others say it was another player, in an altered state, without full consciousness, with involuntary movements. The medical team was called immediately. The player was taken for evaluation. And here begins the first great mystery. What exactly happened to Ronaldo in those hours? The team doctor, Lidio Toledo, stated publicly, days later, that Ronaldo had suffered a seizure at 3 p.m. that afternoon. A convulsion that lasted approximately 1 minute, which left the player confused, disoriented, and clinically unfit, at least in that moment, to compete in a World Cup final. Toledo said Ronaldo was taken to the Lillis Hospital in Paris, where he underwent neurological tests. The tests revealed no serious structural abnormality. But the question that remains is, what kind of evaluation can be done in just a few hours to clear an athlete for the biggest match of his life after a seizure? Any sports doctor you consult today will tell you that the standard protocol after a convulsion requires rest, prolonged observation, and more detailed testing. Not a warm-up on a World Cup pitch 3 hours later. And then came the moment that became a permanent symbol of the confusion of that afternoon. The team sheet. The official lineup submitted by the Brazilian coaching staff to FIFA hours before the match did not include Ronaldo's name. In his place was the name of Edmundo, the animal, who was listed as the starting center forward. That information reached the press. Journalists confirmed it. Ronaldo's absence was announced. And the football world entered a state of shock, because removing Ronaldo from a World Cup final was like removing gravity from a planet. It simply made no sense. But then, minutes before the start of the match, something changed. Ronaldo was on the bus. Ronaldo was in the dressing room. Ronaldo was warming up. And Ronaldo was in the starting lineup, with Edmundo back on the bench. The switch happened so abruptly, so inexplicably, that it generated a wave of questions that never found satisfactory answers. What changed? Who made the decision to put Ronaldo on the field? Was it Coach Zagallo? Was it the medical staff? Or was it something, or someone, beyond the sporting sphere? And here the narrative begins to fork toward what is perhaps the darkest and most controversial part of this entire story. Nike. The word that many people speak quietly when discussing Brazil's 1998 campaign. The relationship between the Brazilian Football Confederation and Nike was, at the time, under investigation by Brazil's own National Congress. In 1996, the CBF had signed a contract with Nike valued at $160 million, one of the largest sports sponsorship deals in history up to that point. The contract stipulated, among other clauses that were later revealed and debated in parliamentary committees, that Nike would have the right to organize friendly matches with the Brazilian national team, with control over dates, opponents, and, according to some interpretations of the contract's clauses, even participation in decisions related to squad selection and player usage. This is not conspiracy theory. It is in the records of Brazil's Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry into Football, established in 2000, which investigated exactly this relationship between the CBF and Nike. The CPI heard from executives, players, and members of the coaching staff. And what emerged from those investigations was a picture of commercial interference in the sporting management of a national team that profoundly disturbed anyone who believes football is, above all, a sport. The question the CPI tried to answer, and never obtained a definitive response to, was simple and brutal. Did Nike have the power to interfere in the decision of whether or not to put Ronaldo on the field in that final? Ronaldo, in interviews over the years that followed, was evasive for a long time. He said he didn't know exactly what had happened to him. He said he felt well enough to play. He said the decision to take the field was his own. But in 2002, in an interview with the Brazilian TV program Fantástico, he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. He said that night was the strangest of his life. That he didn't remember much of what happened. That there was a void in that memory that was never completely filled. Zagallo, for his part, maintained that the decision to play Ronaldo was his and his alone. That the doctor cleared the player. That Ronaldo asked to play. And that as a manager, he respected the wishes of his most important athlete. But Zagallo also said, in moments of greater candor in interviews over the years, that afternoon was chaotic. That there was pressure coming from every direction. That the dressing room was in a state of tension unlike anything he had experienced in decades of football. And then the match begins. And it is here that the narrative takes on a dimension that goes beyond controversy and enters the territory of sporting tragedy. The Ronaldo who walked onto the pitch that night was not the phenomenon. He was a shadow. He was a player with the same number on his back, the same face, the same physical frame, but without the spark, without the explosion, without the overwhelming presence that defined who he was. In the opening minutes, it was clear to any attentive observer that something was wrong. Ronaldo was not challenging for the ball with his usual intensity. His movements were slower. His communication with teammates seemed disconnected. There was something dimmed about him that was painful to watch for anyone who knew what he was capable of being. And while Brazil tried to function as a collective without its greatest piece in full condition, on the other side of the pitch, Zinedine Zidane was in a trance. In the 27th minute, a corner kick. The ball rises. Zidane rises with it. A precise header, into the corner. France 1, Brazil 0. The Stade de France erupts. And then, in the 45th minute, before the interval, another corner. Another delivery. Another header. The same Zidane. The same angle. France 2, Brazil 0. Two headed goals from Zidane, both from corner kicks, both before halftime. In a World Cup final. Against Brazil. It was as if the script for that night had already been written before the ball even rolled. In the second half, Brazil tried to respond. Rivaldo had moments of individual brilliance. Roberto Carlos attacked with his characteristic power. But without Ronaldo functioning at the center of the attack, without that player who created space simply by the force of his presence, the Brazilian team resembled an orchestra playing without its lead instrument. And then, in the 90th minute, Emmanuel Petit sealed the result with the third goal. France 3, Brazil 0. 3-0. In a World Cup final. Against Brazil. That scoreline has no precedent in the history of World Cup finals. No team had conceded 3 goals in a final in the way that defeat occurred, with such a difference in intensity, such an asymmetry of performance between what one team was and what it showed that night. And what followed was an avalanche of questions that swept through the Brazilian and global press in the weeks, months, and years that came after. Ronaldo's medical report became the subject of public debate. Lidio Toledo disclosed part of the information, but there were serious questions about the completeness and transparency of what was revealed. Other members of the coaching staff gave slightly different versions of the timeline of events that afternoon. There are accounts that some players in the Brazilian squad were so shaken by what they were witnessing, by Ronaldo's condition in the hours leading up to the match, that they arrived at the stadium emotionally compromised, with their heads far from football. Cafu, the captain, gave interviews years later saying the dressing room before the final was not a normal dressing room. That there was a different, heavy energy in the air. That the players were worried about Ronaldo while simultaneously trying to mentally prepare for a World Cup final, and that this impossible balance took its toll on the pitch. Roberto Carlos, in an interview for the documentary Ronaldo, released in 2015, one of the most revealing documentaries ever made about the phenomenon, said that seeing Ronaldo in that state was one of the most frightening things he had ever experienced in football. That when Ronaldo got on the bus to go to the stadium, part of the squad still did not know for certain whether he was going to play. And that the uncertainty hanging over that afternoon destroyed any possibility of adequate mental preparation for the match. But let us return to the central question, the one that hovers over all of this like a cloud that never fully lifted. Why did Ronaldo play? If the answer were purely sporting, if the answer were simply that Ronaldo felt well, that the doctors cleared him, that Zagallo assessed the situation and made a decision, then the story would be tragic, but understandable. Athletes make decisions with their hearts in great moments. That is part of sport. But the problem is that the parliamentary investigations revealed a level of entanglement between commercial interest and sporting management that makes it impossible to dismiss other variables. Nike had an obvious interest in Ronaldo, their primary marketing asset on the planet, being on the field in that final. A Ronaldo sitting on the bench in a World Cup final was, commercially, a nightmare for the brand. And the clauses of the contract between the CBF and Nike, never fully made public in their complete form, left enough room for that question to remain without a definitive answer. Deputy Aldo Rebello, who chaired the football CPI, stated in interviews that the investigations found evidence that the Nike contract was anomalous in its nature, with clauses that gave the company a level of interference in the sporting affairs of the national team that would be unacceptable in any other context. But the CPI concluded its work without a definitive finding about what exactly had occurred on the afternoon of July 12, 1998. The versions remained contradictory. The most sensitive documents were never fully made public. And Ronaldo survived all of it. He survived the most disturbing night of his career, returned to being the phenomenon, and won the 2002 World Cup in Japan and South Korea in a manner that was absolutely dominant. He scored 8 goals in the tournament, finished as top scorer, and was named the best player of the competition. He lifted the trophy with his arms open wide and that unforgettable smile, with the famous haircut that became part of football history. It was as though 1998 were a wound he could only heal by placing the entire world at his feet in 2002. But the echo of 1998 was never completely silenced. There is a photograph from that final that says more than any words could. It is an image of Ronaldo during the match, with a distant look in his eyes, his shoulders slightly dropped, caught in a moment between plays. It is not the look of an athlete focused on a maximum stakes contest. It is a look that seems to belong somewhere else. That seems to belong to another scene, another moment, another dimension entirely apart from that pitch under the lights of the Stade de France. It is a photograph that, when you see it knowing everything that happened that afternoon, produces a discomfort that is difficult to name. And here is what this story truly represents beyond football. The scandal of the 1998 World Cup, if we can call it a scandal, since nothing was definitively proven, but nothing was definitively dismissed either, is a mirror held up to the nature of modern football. It reflects the moment when sport ceased to be simply sport and became business, product, brand asset. The moment when a 21-year-old player, the best in the world, could simultaneously become the greatest protagonist and the greatest victim of the same night. France won that World Cup deservedly. Zidane was extraordinary. Jacquet's team was organized, collective, and efficient. Nobody disputes that. But the question that remains, and that will probably never have an answer that fully satisfies, is whether the Brazil that walked onto the pitch that night was truly the Brazil that should have walked onto that pitch. And if the answer is no, if the answer is that Brazil was, in some way, defeated before crossing the white line that marks the boundary of the field, then what happened that night was not simply a sporting defeat. It was something more complex, more troubling, and more revealing about the world that surrounds football than any final scoreline could ever capture. That is the story 1998 holds. Not only in the final results, not only in the statistics, but in the silence that still exists between the versions, in the memories that have still not been completely told, and in the questions that still today, more than 2 decades later, make any Brazilian who lived through that night feel a tightening in the chest that goes far beyond football. If you made it this far, you are the kind of person who wants to understand football for real, not just the goals but everything behind them. So tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? Do you believe there was external interference in that final? Were you alive in 1998, or did you discover this story later? And what city and country are you watching from right now? Every comment matters, and I read them all. Drop a like. That simple gesture helps this channel enormously to keep bringing the stories that mainstream media prefers not to dig into. And if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe now, because the next stories are even more powerful than this one. And one quick thing before I go. While searching through the world of football and nostalgia, I found something very interesting that has everything to do with those who grew up watching the sport and carry these moments in their hearts. I left the link in the first pinned comment. It is not an advertisement, it is a genuine recommendation for something worth your curiosity. Go take a look. And keep the channel close, because very soon I am going to tell the story of a World Cup match that was played under death threats, where players received messages inside their own hotel before taking the field, and where the final result still raises suspicions that reached Interpol. That is football. That is history. And you will want to be here when that story is told.